Hi, I'm Kristen Goodwin. On this episode of the Fox News Rundown, who won the final presidential debate? And with 11 days until the election, how will it impact an already tightening race? Fox News Radio's national correspondent Jared Halpern and Fox News Radio's political analyst Josh Kraushaar break down the night's biggest moments with Real Clear Politics president Tom Bevan. And Judge Amy Coney Barrett is one step closer to securing a seat on the Supreme Court as Republicans on a Senate panel advanced her nomination, with Democratic senators boycotting the proceedings. Democratic presidential nominee Joe Biden now says if elected, he would create a bipartisan commission to study whether changes should be made to the Supreme Court. Fox News Sunday host Chris Wallace shares his insight on whether Mr. Biden's response will satisfy voters, recent battleground polls, and the debate over the Electoral College. Plus commentary from Fox Nation host Tammy Bruce. The Fox News Rundown is a daily news podcast where we take a deeper look at the stories important to you. You can subscribe on your favorite podcast player by going to foxnewspodcasts.com.
I'm Janice Dean.
I'm David Asman.
I'm Dana Perino, and this is the Fox News Rundown.
Friday, October 23rd, 2020. I'm Jared Halpern. President Trump and former Vice President Biden make their final pitch to voters in the final debate.
You know, they both sort of scored their points on the two most important issues as far as voters are concerned in this election.
I'm Chris Foster. It doesn't look like anything can stop Amy Coney Barrett's confirmation to the Supreme Court. Fox News Sunday host Chris Wallace.
Putting 3 justices on the Supreme Court will be the most important legacy of Donald Trump's first and possibly only term.
And I'm Tammy Bruce. I've got the final word on the Fox News Rundown.
"11 days. That's all the time that's left for President Trump and former Vice President Joe Biden to convince you they are the right man for the next 4 years. The closing arguments were made in the second and final presidential debate, a far more polite and policy-driven affair than the first debate 3 weeks ago. Still, the candidates drew stark distinctions on how to handle the ongoing coronavirus pandemic.
We're about to go into a dark winter. And he has no clear plan, and there's no prospect that there's going to be a vaccine available for the majority of the American people before the middle of next year.
President Trump, your reaction, he says you have no plan.
I don't think we're going to have a dark winter at all. We're opening up our country. We've learned and studied and understand the disease, which we didn't at the beginning.
Both candidates' previous dealings with China were an issue as they made the case over who would be a stronger economic force.
The foreign countries are paying you a lot. Russia's paying you a lot. China's paying you a lot. And your hotels and all your businesses all around the country, all around the world. And China's building a new road to a new a golf course you have overseas. So what's going on here? Why don't release your tax return or stop talking about corruption?
And as had been forecasted by the Trump campaign, questions were raised about Joe Biden's son Hunter and reports of his overseas dealings. Accusations answered with questions for the president about his taxes and overseas investments.
I don't make money from China. You do. I don't make money from Ukraine. You do. I don't make money from Russia. You made $3.5 million, Joe, and your son gave you. They even have a statement that we have to give 10% to the big man. You're the big man, I think.
But even before the two men joined the debate stage with moderator Kristen Welker of NBC News, more than 47 million votes had been cast, with fewer undecided voters 2 weeks out than previous elections.
That's a pretty good chunk of the electorate that's already cast their vote.
Tom Bevan is the co-founder of Real Clear Politics. He joined Fox News radio analyst Josh Kraushaar and me for a post-debate chat about the big moments and if they will move the needle for that shrinking group of undecided voters.
So how many of those folks that are left are in the undecided are actually persuadable? And where do those folks live? Do they live in states like North Carolina or Pennsylvania or Wisconsin or Michigan, where their votes might actually, if they are persuaded, might actually matter? Probably pretty small, but to the extent that there are those people, and you know, it'd be on the margins, but I do think there's still a chance that I'm not sure that anything that happened was dramatic enough to move voters in a real significant way.
And so that's what I was going to ask, right? Obviously, there were a lot of exchanges about the coronavirus. There were exchanges about energy policy, about the relationship with China. There was a spirited exchange between the president's tax returns and Hunter Biden's emails. Any of that move the needle for voters at this stage? Or maybe of those issues, what is most likely to move the needle for voters at this stage?
Look, I thought the president actually, did a pretty good job, much better than he did in the first debate. Scored points. I mean, if you think about the two most important issues in this election are the economy, number one, and COVID, number two. I thought the president got the better of Biden of the economy, on opening up the country, on the issues of energy, when he was talking about, shutting down the oil industry, that sort of thing. But the first, 10 or 15 minutes of the debate was spent on COVID, on the handling of the COVID crisis. That is Trump's weakest point, and I thought it showed. I thought Biden actually had pretty good responses to Trump, and so they both sort of scored their points on the two most important issues as far as voters are concerned in this election. And so again, I mean, it's sort of cliche, but if you treat this as like a boxing match, there were no knockouts. You could score it on points, and it was probably, some folks would probably say maybe Trump won it on points by a couple, or maybe some folks would say Biden won it on points by a couple. But either way, that's sort of in the eye of the beholder. I don't think there was any singular moment that was really it was so dramatic that's really going to influence voters in a significant way.
And so I guess to expand on that analogy, the boxing analogy, no fighter came out sort of very bloodied.
Yeah, I mean, I think both candidates made their points. Biden had a couple of moments where he sort of struggled, I think, to formulate his answers, and he was on the defensive. But he didn't spend the whole time on the defensive. And I was a little bit shocked. I mean, we knew Trump was going to raise the Hunter Biden scandal issue, and that was featured in the debate.
All of the emails, the horrible emails of the kind of money that you were raking in, you and your family. And Joe, you were vice president when some of this was happening, and it should have never happened. And I think you owe an explanation to the American people.
But he didn't go at him as hard. He could have redirected a lot of those questions back to Joe Biden on the issue at hand. And at one point, Kristen Welker, who I thought, by and large did a pretty good job of moderating, but she jumped in and saved Biden a couple times when Trump was, had asked him, hey, are you the big guy? I think the American people deserve to know. And that was the moment where she sort of jumped in and said, look, we got to change subjects. And Biden never really answered that question. I suspect we're going to hear more of that in the final week and a half of this campaign. But it didn't play as prominently as I thought it would have, given how the Trump campaign was talking about it as leading into this debate.
Tom, you mentioned the pandemic and Trump's uneven response in that first exchange. I was kind of struck that Trump has made some points, but he hasn't really hashed out the argument. And I'm thinking about the issue of schools and schools not opening. And Trump mentioned Andrew Cuomo's reaction to the pandemic. Schools are open in New York City. I'm surprised that the president hasn't drawn a wedge, with and tried to force Biden to articulate what his view would be about opening schools and trying to have a path forward on that front. What was your thought on that exchange specifically? And is that something you think that Republicans could score some political points on in the future?
I mean, a little bit, but the problem for Trump when he's talking about COVID is he's almost always on the defensive, and because he's been in office and it's happened on his watch, and for better or worse. The result is we've got 220,000 dead Americans. And he can say, and I think there is plenty of evidence to support that. We've all seen the clips of Nancy Pelosi in Chinatown in February, and Bill de Blasio saying, ride the subway. Democrats were not ahead of the curve on their handling of this virus. I mean, they just weren't. That is a fact. But Biden, can sort of just glide by that and say, look, I've got a plan. Trump hasn't had a plan. We've been at this for 6 months. So as a result, whether the issue is on schools or on businesses or on whatever, Trump is constantly sort of playing defense.
Yeah, I don't want to steal this question from Josh because he wouldn't have been able to ask it for you because he brought it up in our conversation earlier. But this exchange that happened near the end of the debate, Tom, about energy policy, about fracking, and then about oil.
Would he close down the oil industry?
It falls.
Would you close down the oil industry?
By the way, I would transition from the oil industry, yes. I will
that's
transition.
a big statement.
It is a big statement.
That's a big
because
statement.
I would stop.
Why would you do that?
Because the oil industry pollutes significantly.
That is an answer that certainly the president said was a big moment in this debate. Josh has talked about how it could have some impacts, maybe even down ballot for a lot of these candidates in key states like, Pennsylvania, Ohio. How big an issue is that as you sort of look at the numbers, this issue of energy and fracking versus sort of coming off of some of these fossil fuels to a more, new, cleaner energy?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a huge issue. And look, I'm not one of these people. I think Texas will be closer than it was 4 years ago, but I don't think Trump's going to lose Texas. But certainly, John Cornyn probably cracked a smile when he heard that. And some of these other folks who are running in Texas, where the top of the ticket, where Joe Biden talks openly about moving away from oil and transitioning to renewable energy in the sort of near future. That plays into this idea that he's beholden, he's backing a Green New Deal, and he's there are radical policies and that are in the offing if he's elected. I think the more urgent issue, to your point, is in Pennsylvania and the issue of fracking. I mean, and we've seen that Trump folks dial in on this in a very sort of specific way, right? Where he was actually showing to his crowd the other night, this rally in Pennsylvania, he's showing clips of Biden saying that he was in favor of banning fracking, to sort of prove the point that, like, hey, don't take it from me. Listen to Joe Biden's own words. I think that's pretty effective, and I think it could be. I think that's one of the reasons we've seen the race in Pennsylvania tighten. I think it's going to continue to tighten, and because, again, at the bottom of the, sort of at the fundamentals, the economy is still the number one issue across the board. Doesn't matter what state you look at, nationally, any of the polls, it's still the economy. COVID is there. It's a number two. In some cases, it's a close number two, and healthcare is a close, third. But the economy is still number one. And so to the extent that Trump can leverage that and exploit that, it's to his benefit in a lot of these states, particularly in a place like Pennsylvania.
Hey, Tom, it seems like so many people have already made up their minds. The people are already voting, in fact, over 45 million across the country. Do you think that, this has an impact in any real way at the top of the ticket or even down ballot with some of these big Senate or House races?
I mean, it's hard to say, Josh. You know this. I mean, look, anybody who's voted early, who's taken advantage of early voting, is most likely somebody who's a committed voter. If you're really undecided, are you going to run out and vote like the first day that, early voting is an option for you? Probably not. So in that sense, while there have been a large number of people that have already voted early, most of those folks, you have to assume, are committed, either Democrats or Republicans. I mean, they were ready to race out and cast their vote. They decided, 2 weeks ago, 2 months ago, 2 years ago even. But if you are truly undecided, if you're truly sort of a moderate who's on the fence, maybe there are still people out there that can be persuaded in the last 10 days of a race, and they're going to show up on election day. So, and again, if your theory of the case is that the polls are going to close, or that Trump's going to overperform his poll numbers in some of these states like he did in 2016, and these races, in places like Pennsylvania and North Carolina and, the 6 battleground states that we're currently tracking are going to be close, then yeah, it could matter. It could. I mean, we won't know the answer to that until November 3rd or 4th, or maybe even longer than that. But I'm not sold on the idea that this thing is so, the cake is so baked already that there's no room for movement, because even on the margins, if it's close, it could matter.
We will have answers, as you point out, Tom, very soon. Now, as you listen to this, 11 days from Election Day. Tom Bevan, appreciate the time, as always, to wrap up debate season here in the 2020 cycle.
This is Tammy Bruce with your Fox News commentary coming up.
We did it. We did it.
Senate Judiciary Committee Chairman Lindsey Graham after the vote recommending Judge Amy Coney Barrett's confirmation to the Supreme Court.
I've been here a while, and I've never seen anyone more capable than Judge Barrett on the law.
The vote was unanimous, 12-0, because Democrats boycotted. The top Senate Democrat, Chuck Schumer.
The nomination of Amy Coney Barrett is the most illegitimate process I have ever witnessed in the Senate, and her potential confirmation will have dire consequences for the Senate, for the Supreme Court, and our entire country for generations to come.
There doesn't appear to be anything Democrats can do about it, though.
There's political theater here. The Democrats not participating in the committee vote, and who knows what they'll do when it gets to the floor of the Senate on Monday.
Chris Wallace is the host of Fox News Sunday. We spoke prior to last night's debate.
But there's no drama. The Republicans have the votes. They're going to push it through. She'll be a justice on the court. And let me put this in a little bit of context. There are a lot of people in the Republican side, even in the Trump White House, who believe, forget about the economy, forget about the war on terror and killing al-Baghdadi and Soleimani, that putting 3 justices on the Supreme Court will be the most important legacy of Donald Trump's first and possibly only term, but of these 4 years. That not only that, actually, just remaking the judiciary. He will have gotten more than 200 of his appointees named to the district court, to the courts of appeal, and to the 3 to the Supreme Court. That's going to have a huge legacy. I mean, Amy Coney Barrett is 48 years old. She could be on the court 30 years ruling on cases. So this may be the biggest part of Donald Trump's legacy.
Yeah, absolutely. And this number could even be low at this point, but something like a quarter of current appeals court judges now were put there by President Trump in just the last, not even 4 years. And to that point, Joe Biden has sort of given his answer about whether he'd be in favor of adding more justices to the Supreme Court and the federal judiciary. He says he'd create a commission to study it. He says things have gotten out of whack. Is that fair enough?
It's a classic Washington answer, which is a non-answer. You say, I'm going to appoint a commission, and he says it's going to be blue ribbon, and there'll be Republicans on it, and there'll be Democrats on it, and then they'll let me know in 180 days, which is 6 months. So you know what that is all? That's basically saying, that's my answer. That's the answer for the debate. That's the answer for the last week of the election, of the campaign, and hopefully that'll be good enough. My guess is the president, is going to continue to hammer it and say, well, you don't need a commission. What do you think? And there certainly are plenty of Democrats who ran against Biden, including Pete Buttigieg, Mayor Pete, who was on our show last Sunday, who still talks about reforming the court and adding justices to the court. So my guess is it'll help Biden get through the final week of the campaign, but let's understand it for what it is. It's a punt.
Yeah, I mean, the audience will, I hope, forgive me if we brought this up before in this way, but there was a time when you put somebody on the Supreme Court and they lived 10 years. Now they're living, Amy Coney Barrett could be on the court for 40 years. And maybe court packing is, the problem with court packing in my mind is you just, every subsequent administration can just say, okay, we're going to add 2, 4, 6, 8 infinity judges. Maybe we talk about making them 10 and 20-year appointments.
I have to say, I increasingly agree with exactly that point. Because if you have a court now, if Amy Coney Barrett goes on, it'll be 6-3 in terms of Republican-appointed justices and 3 Democratic-appointed justices. Given that Roberts is kind of a swing vote, it's 5.5 to 3.5. But so that's 9. Now, but saying it's 6, now you're going to need 13 justices. So they're going to need to appoint 4 more justices to give the Democrats a majority. That means 4 more. So then you'll have 7 Democratic appointed, 6 Republican, and then exactly as you say, then when the next Republican comes in, it would be 15 justices on the court. It becomes absurd. But I think your point is I really kind of think that may be the answer, is it's just too long to say, I understand the reason for it, which is, you don't have anything to worry about. You're going to be in this job for the rest of your life. You're immune from political pressure. But I think, given as you say, that you can live into your 80s, as we saw with Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Stephen Breyer's in his 80s, another Clinton-appointed justice. I think the idea of 15, 20-year terms in the court, which gives you an awful lot of job security and immunity from political pressure, to me it makes more sense, and it doesn't make the appointment of a judge a huge generational issue that Amy Coney Barrett is going to. I mean, again, she could be in the court in 2050.
Right. Well, and just like you said, President Trump randomly getting this power, he happens to have 3 justices on his watch. Well, 2 died on his watch. Where some presidents don't get any. It just seems far too random to me which justices drop dead, depending, if there's a Democrat or Republican in the White House.
Yeah, it also, I suppose, speaks to the issue. This may get me in trouble, but the times change. Now, I would rarely say this gets me in trouble because conservatives will say, well, the times change, but the Constitution doesn't change, and the fact that it's 2050 rather than 2020 shouldn't make any difference. But the fact is times do change, and maybe it's not bad to have some people appointed in 2050 or 2040 rather than have somebody who's appointed in 2020 continue on in the court. The idea of court packing I really don't like. I think it ought to stay at 9. That's not a magic number. It's been more and less over the years, but it's been 9 since the 1870s. The idea of a limit on court tenure, to me, makes sense, but it's got to be a long one. It's got to be, I think, 15, 20 years. 10 years would be too short.
Okay. New Fox polls just out showing the president ahead in Ohio now, behind in Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. As I think we may have talked about, if you play with the numbers and just assign certain states to each candidate, it looks like it could be Biden by a lot or the president by a hair. That hasn't changed. Yeah. Look, in any other circumstance, we would be, and I'm not saying that this is right, we would be saying that Joe Biden, not that it's wrapped up, it's never wrapped up until Election Day, or in this case, a week later, but we would be saying that Biden is in, a commanding lead. We're afraid to say that because of what happened in 2016, and I think rightfully afraid to say it. But, I mean, if you look at all the objective metrics at this moment, you would say that, Biden is leading by 8 to 11 points nationally. He's leading in states that if he were to continue on in those states, he would have a more than 270 electoral votes. Can Trump turn it around? Absolutely. Did he turn it around in 2016? Absolutely. But, there's no contradicting the fact Biden is in the lead right now. If President Trump loses the popular vote and wins again, we might see this even greater push to end the Electoral College. The majority of Americans don't like it, but that means voters in smaller states lose their power. But, should a vote in Wyoming count more than 3 times as much as a vote in California? I've gone back and forth on this. I kind of like the Electoral College. Maybe I'm a traditionalist about it. But I just worry that if you give it up, your point, I didn't know it was 3 times as many, but I certainly was aware that a vote in Wyoming is worth more, than a vote in another state, just in terms of electoral votes. It's also true in the Senate, because that's part of what the Constitution did, is it said Wyoming has 2 senators, and so does California. And that's why you get this disparity in electoral votes and population. But, it just strikes me, if it's just popular vote, you could see, particularly a Democratic candidate, simply go and campaign in the big metropolitan centers, Los Angeles, Chicago, New York, a few others, and basically ignore wide swaths of the country. And I think it does, to me anyway, it seems good that, senators have to take into account the vote in Wisconsin and Iowa and places like that, may obviously in terms of population aren't as big, but have a real role to play and are crucial in the electoral vote count. I just think it makes a president respond to national issues rather than just urban inner city issues, because that's where most of the votes are. If Joe Biden wants to get anything done, if he's elected, he may need the Senate. It's looking increasingly like the Senate may turn blue. Any races you're particularly interested in?
Oh, I think a bunch. I was writing them down the other day, the races where Republican incumbents are in real trouble. Joni Ernst in Iowa, Steve Daines in Montana, Tillis, Susan Collins probably in the most trouble in Maine. And, you've even got a state like David Perdue in Georgia, Lindsey Graham in South Carolina. Those are states, you haven't seen a Democratic senator for a while, and there's a possibility there. This, I think, really speaks to what's going to happen on Election Day, both with the early vote and then what happens with people showing up to vote in person, is if there's a real blue wave tsunami, as some people are suggesting, and certainly as, if you look at the polls right now seem to indicate, you could really see a lot of senators, Republican senators, swept out. On the other hand, if it's more like 2016, the president will do better than he is right now in a lot of these swing states, and the Republican senators will do better than they are right now in a lot of these states where, some of them aren't swing states and for senators. They're states that you would expect the Republican to be pretty safe, but at least according to the polls right now, isn't.
Chris Wallace, host of Fox News Sunday. You've got 2 shows left before the election. Make them count.
Thank you, Chris.
From the Fox News Podcasts Network. In these ever-changing times, you can rely on Fox News for hourly updates for the very latest news and information on your time. Listen and download now at foxnewspodcast.com or wherever you get your favorite podcasts.
And now, some good news with Tanya J. Powers.
This week's good news comes from best-selling author Brad Meltzer. I talked to him recently about one of the newest books in his Ordinary People Change the World series for kids. He told me about one called I Am Anne Frank, the young Jewish girl who documented her life while hiding from the Nazis for 2 years in an attic during World War II. While researching the history for the book, Brad told me he came across a story that really touched him.
One of my favorite stories I found was that when Anne Frank was hidden in that attic, she had one little window that she would stare out. And out that window, the only view she had was a chestnut tree. And she'd look at it in the winter and watch the leaves fall off. The leaves would come back, of course, in the spring. And that was her view. In 2010, that chestnut tree was sadly knocked down. But here's what happened. They took the saplings from that tree and all the seeds, and they planted them around the world. And today, there are trees, Anne Frank trees, growing stronger than ever all across the globe. I don't know a better way to teach hope than that. And it is just proof that when you tell your kids an amazing story, Anne Frank's story lives on stronger than ever.
Those Anne Frank trees can be found in Arkansas, Idaho, Massachusetts, California, and Indiana, among other places. There's also one on the west front lawn of the U.S. Capitol in Washington, D.C., and one in New York City, standing just feet away from the footprint of the Twin Towers at the 9/11 Memorial in Lower Manhattan. If your community would like to be considered for an Anne Frank garden or a sapling, go to annefrank.com. And to learn more about Brad and his books, go to bradmeltzer.com. Tanya J. Powers, Fox News.
It's time for your Fox News commentary. Tammy, Bruce. What's on your mind?
The Steve Scully and Jeffrey Toobin scandals appear on the surface to be quite far apart about what they represent and mean about the state of so-called journalism today. But in fact, they issue a very similar warning to everyone. The legacy media has devolved into theater, peopled with corner salesmen who are rarely what they purport to be. The Scully debacle in particular reveals so much about more than just him, but about the system in general. The scandal began with a now-deleted tweet to Trump hater Anthony Scaramucci, which read, "Scaramucci, should I respond to Trump?" Mr. Scaramucci is not only opposed to the president, but gives the impression of being an active enemy who wishes to ruin Mr. Trump. For those familiar with the Twitter platform, that message appeared to be meant as a private communication known as a direct message. If one is not paying attention, your intended private message can go on the public timeline. During the ensuing outrage, Mr. Scully insisted his Twitter account had been hacked. That excuse was laughable, and yet C-SPAN reiterated this and noted they were investigating and had alerted the FBI. About a week later, Mr. Scully admitted that, in fact, he lied about his account being hacked. C-SPAN announced Mr. Scully had been put on indefinite leave, issuing a statement which read in part, "By not being immediately forthcoming to C-SPAN and the commission about his tweet, he understands that he made a serious mistake. Starting immediately, we have placed Steve on administrative leave." After some distance from this episode, we believe in his ability to continue to contribute to C-SPAN. Since the suspension of Mr. Scully, the story has dropped from view, but the other absurdities involved in this episode speak to the larger ethic issues with today's media. In his statement, Mr. Scully implies he meant to tweet Mr. Scaramucci publicly, a man who is hostile to the president, just before Mr. Scully is set to moderate the debate. That's unbelievable on its face. But he also can't very well admit that it was supposed to be a secret communication, because that confirms the nature of what he was doing. That alone is something C-SPAN should be extremely concerned about. Then we have anti-Trump pundit Jeffrey Toobin. Mr. Toobin, a staff writer for 25 years at The New Yorker, as well as CNN's chief legal analyst for 18 years, has been suspended from the magazine for having exposed himself during a work Zoom call with New Yorker magazine and New York Public Radio staff. Mr. Toobin explained that he didn't think anyone could see him because he thought he had muted the video portion of the call. He then apologized to his friends and family for the obscene display. The New Yorker magazine is investigating the incident, and his Condé Nast email has been disabled. CNN, however, is another story. It simply announced that Mr. Toobin was taking some time off to deal with a personal matter. No details were provided to the CNN audience about why its chief legal analyst was no longer available. On Tuesday, the network finally provided more detailed coverage, pointing to Mr. Toobin's excuse that it was an accident. Mr. Scully and Mr. Toobin have been viewed as respected, trustworthy journalists over time. Mr. Scully was defended as a fair, reasonable journalist who operates on dignity and has a character we can all trust. Instead, he is someone who appears to have presented one persona to the public while working covertly with one of the worst anti-Trump operatives available. Mr. Toobin, unhinged in his hostility toward President Trump, is a natural part of the CNN brigade, hammering home almost every day how awful the president is, morally and otherwise. It's Mr. Trump who can't be trusted, who isn't what he says, who is a bad man, who makes a mess of everything. It's past time Mr. Scully and Mr. Toobin start looking in the mirror, a piece of advice too many in the legacy media could benefit from.
This is Tammy Bruce.
You've been listening to the Fox News Rundown. Stay up to date by subscribing to this podcast at foxnewspodcasts.com. And for up-to-the-minute news, go to foxnews.com. It's the Perino and Steyerwalt I'll Tell You What podcast. Dana Perino of The Five and Fox News political editor Chris Steyerwalt dissect the ins and outs of national politics. Subscribe and listen now by going to foxnewspodcasts.com. Subscribe to this podcast at foxnewspodcasts.com.
Love Fox News? Click the subscribe button to get more of the news and opinion you trust. And click the Fox News Rundown playlist for the latest episodes.